The hand that grabbed Mayme Johnson's wrist outside Blumstein's department store on 125th Street at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Wednesday, June 19, 1957, belonged to NYPD Sergeant Michael Patrick O'Sullivan of the 28th Precinct. 43 years old with 21 years on the force and reputation throughout Harlem as one of the most corrupt and brutal officers in district that newspapers and community activists had long described as policed by racist army of occupation, where white officers assigned to predominantly black neighborhoods treated residents as enemy population requiring suppression rather than citizens deserving protection and service, and where systemic corruption involving gambling payoffs, protection rackets, evidence planting, false arrests, and casual violence against black citizens operated with virtual impunity because departmental oversight was minimal, internal affairs investigations were rare, and political leadership prioritized maintaining white police officers' support over addressing black communities' complaints about abuses that had been documented but never meaningfully addressed despite decades of protests, commission investigations, and reform promises that consistently failed to produce substantive changes in how NYPD policed Harlem and other black neighborhoods throughout New York City. Sergeant O'Sullivan's decision to physically grab Mayme Johnson in broad daylight on busy Commercial Street reflected toxic combination of personal racism, professional impunity from consequences, alcohol consumption during his shift, and deliberate provocation intended to demonstrate his power over black residents who he viewed as naturally inferior and deserving of whatever treatment white police officers chose to inflict, regardless of whether victims had committed any offense or violated any law. O'Sullivan had been drinking since approximately noon when he left his desk at 28th Precinct Station House to conduct what he called community relations patrol that actually consisted of stopping at bars where he collected protection payments from owners who paid monthly fees, ensuring that police wouldn't harass their establishments with health code violations, liquor license inspections, or arrests of patrons for minor offenses that every bar technically violated, but that selective enforcement converted into extortion opportunities for corrupt officers who controlled which businesses faced consequences and which operated unmolested. This documentary explores the systemic police corruption and brutality that characterized NYPD's relationship with Harlem during 1950s, when corrupt white officers treated black neighborhoods as opportunities for extraction and oppression rather than communities deserving equal protection under law, creating situations where residents developed profound distrust of police and where criminal organizations sometimes provided the only meaningful accountability for police misconduct that official channels either ignored or actively protected through institutional cover-ups and officer solidarity that valued protecting fellow cops over serving justice or addressing legitimate community grievances. While we present these events for historical understanding, we recognize that extrajudicial violence against police officers, regardless of provocation or justification for outrage at systemic abuses, undermined legal institutions and democratic processes that should govern responses to official misconduct, though we acknowledge the profound institutional failures that created situations where communities facing persistent police brutality had no effective legal recourse and sometimes relied on criminal power to enforce boundaries that law enforcement officials refused to respect. Age-restricted for mature audiences studying police corruption history, racial justice struggles, organized crime's complex role in communities, and the moral complications arising when institutional failures force impossible choices between accepting injustice and depending on criminal violence for protection from state abuse. Mayme Johnson was 43 years old in June 1957, had been married to Bumpy for 9 years, and had developed sophisticated understanding of how to navigate Harlem's streets safely, despite multiple threats including corrupt police officers whose racism and sense of impunity made them potentially more dangerous than criminals, because criminals at least feared retaliation from Bumpy's organization, while police operated with institutional protection that historically made them nearly immune from consequences when they brutalized black citizens. She wore that afternoon a navy blue dress appropriate for Wednesday afternoon shopping, carried handbag containing approximately $840 in cash that Bumpy had given her for purchasing items the household needed, and had just exited Blumstein's after buying fabric for new curtains when Sergeant O'Sullivan grabbed her wrist hard enough to cause immediate pain and forced her to stop walking so he could deliver racist insult designed to humiliate her publicly and demonstrate his power to abuse black women without facing accountability. The words Sergeant O'Sullivan spoke after grabbing Mayme combined racist slur with sexual harassment and threat of arrest on fabricated charges that corrupt police frequently used to extort money from black citizens who understood that refusing to pay bribes often resulted in being taken to precinct station where additional abuse, including physical violence, false charges, and potentially weeks or months in jail awaiting trial, would follow because courts rarely believed black defendants' complaints about police misconduct over white officers' testimony, regardless of how implausible police accounts might be. O'Sullivan's statement was loud enough for surrounding pedestrians to hear. "Well, if it isn't Bumpy Johnson's fancy nugger whore walking around my streets like she owns them, maybe I should run you in for prostitution solicitation. Or maybe we can work out arrangement where you show proper respect to officers who let criminals like your husband operate in this precinct that I'm responsible for keeping safe from animals like him and uppity bitches like you." The approximately 47 seconds between O'Sullivan grabbing Mayme's wrist and Samuel Chen's arrival to intervene involved Mayme maintaining dignified composure despite physical pain and psychological assault, refusing to respond to O'Sullivan's provocation with anger or fear that might give him excuse to escalate violence, and calculating how to extract herself from situation without triggering arrest that would require Bumpy's organization to navigate complex process of securing her release, while also planning retaliation against corrupt sergeant whose actions represented not isolated incident but pattern of abuse that multiple Harlem residents had experienced from O'Sullivan specifically and from 28th Precinct officers generally over years of systematic oppression that community complaints had failed to address through official channels. Samuel Chen's presence on 125th Street was coincidental rather than planned protective detail, as he happened to be conducting his own errands when he noticed the confrontation between O'Sullivan and Mayme approximately half-block away and immediately recognized both parties and understood the dangerous situation unfolding. Chen was Bumpy Johnson's financial manager and intelligence chief, had been with Johnson's organization for 14 years since 1943, and possessed sophisticated understanding of how to manage volatile situations involving corrupt police officers whose racism toward black people coexisted with racist attitudes toward Chinese people that made Chen himself potential target for abuse from officers like O'Sullivan who viewed all non-white residents as legitimate subjects for harassment and exploitation. Chen's approach to the confrontation was strategically calculated to de-escalate immediate crisis while gathering information necessary for planning longer-term response to O'Sullivan's misconduct. He positioned himself within earshot but maintained respectful distance, suggesting deference rather than confrontation, addressed O'Sullivan as Sergeant, with tone conveying respect for rank rather than personal regard, and offered explanation for Mayme's presence that might satisfy O'Sullivan's need to assert authority while allowing him to release her without losing face in front of witnesses who were watching the encounter with mix of concern for Mayme's safety and resignation about police officers' power to abuse black citizens without consequences. Chen's statement was carefully worded. Sergeant O'Sullivan, Mrs. Johnson is conducting legitimate shopping business for her household. I'm sure there's been misunderstanding that we can resolve respectfully without anyone needing to file reports or involve supervisors who might have questions about circumstances. The implicit threat in Chen's polite statement that involving supervisors might create problems for O'Sullivan if questions arose about why he was grabbing women on street during duty hours when he was supposed to be on patrol, combined with Chen's suggestion that Johnson's organization would not escalate incident if O'Sullivan released Mayme without further confrontation, created face-saving opportunity for O'Sullivan to back down while maintaining fiction that he had been conducting legitimate police business rather than engaging in racist harassment for personal gratification. O'Sullivan's alcohol impairment and general arrogance nearly caused him to reject the compromise and escalate by arresting Mayme on fabricated charges, but his survival instincts recognized that attacking Johnson's wife might trigger retaliation exceeding whatever protection his NYPD badge and 28th Precinct colleagues might provide. The decision O'Sullivan made to release Mayme's wrist while delivering additional verbal insult about how Chinese rat was interfering with police business represented tactical retreat that preserved O'Sullivan's pride while avoiding immediate confrontation that even his alcohol-clouded judgment recognized as potentially catastrophic for his personal safety. He walked away from the encounter believing he had demonstrated his power through physical contact and racist abuse that would remind Johnson's wife and organization that police could attack them whenever they chose, and that Black and Chinese residents had no recourse against white officers whose institutional protection made them effectively untouchable through legal channels that historically sided with police over minority complainants regardless of evidence or witnesses supporting citizens' accounts of abuse. If you've witnessed corrupt police officers abusing power through racist harassment protected by institutional systems refusing to hold them accountable, subscribe and comment about situations where authority figures exploited systemic failures enabling misconduct without consequences. Because what happened next would demonstrate that while legal institutions might refuse to address police brutality against Black citizens, criminal organizations possessed capabilities and willingness to impose accountability through extra-legal means that should horrify us ethically, while also revealing profound institutional failures forcing communities to choose between accepting police oppression and relying on criminal violence to enforce boundaries that law should protect but doesn't. Bumpy Johnson learned about the incident at 4:23 p.m. when Samuel Chen called him from payphone to report O'Sullivan's attack on Mayme, providing detailed account of officers' racist insults, physical grab that left visible bruising on Mayme's wrist, sexual harassment suggesting prostitution, and threat of false arrest that represented standard extortion tactic corrupt 28th Precinct officers used against Black residents who they targeted for shakedowns justified through fabricated allegations of criminality that courts rarely questioned despite victims' testimony about police corruption and abuse. Johnson's response was characterized by cold, controlled fury that everyone in his organization recognized as far more dangerous than explosive rage, because Johnson's calculated anger produced systematic retaliation designed not just to punish individual offenders, but to send deterrent messages that would discourage future similar attacks by making costs of abusing Johnson's interests exceed any benefits corrupt officers might gain from harassment or extortion. The intelligence file that Johnson's organization maintained on Sergeant Michael O'Sullivan contained extensive documentation of his corruption and brutality accumulated over 7 years since 1950, when O'Sullivan had first begun operating in 28th Precinct after being transferred from Manhattan's South Precinct, where he had been investigated for excessive force complaints but never disciplined because witnesses had recanted their statements after visits from other officers who suggested that pursuing complaints might result in additional problems including arrests of family members, evictions from housing, or loss of employment through police contacts with landlords and employers who cooperated with NYPD to maintain good relationships useful for their own business interests. The file included details about O'Sullivan's weekly protection collections totaling approximately $2,800 monthly from various Harlem businesses, his pattern of planting evidence to manufacture arrests that boosted his statistics and justified his continued employment despite numerous complaints about brutality, his alcoholism that manifested in increasingly erratic and violent behavior toward residents he encountered during patrols, and his financial situation including mortgage on house in Queens, gambling debts estimated at $6,400, and alimony payments to ex-wife following 1953 divorce that had resulted from his domestic violence and chronic infidelity. The strategic question Johnson faced was whether to pursue immediate violent retaliation that would satisfy emotional needs for vengeance while risking escalation with NYPD that might trigger intensive investigation of his organization, or whether to implement more sophisticated campaign that would destroy O'Sullivan's life systematically while maintaining plausible deniability about Johnson's involvement and minimizing risks to his operations. The decision Johnson made reflected his strategic intelligence and understanding that most effective punishment involved not just inflicting pain, but completely dismantling targets' sense of security and future prospects in ways that served both revenge and deterrent purposes, while also potentially creating opportunities to pressure other corrupt 28th Precinct officers into moderating their abuse of Harlem residents by demonstrating that attacking Johnson's interests or family would trigger consequences that institutional protection couldn't prevent. The plan Johnson developed over approximately 90 minutes involved multiple coordinated operations targeting different aspects of O'Sullivan's life, including his employment with NYPD through anonymous complaints to Internal Affairs about specific corrupt activities that Johnson's intelligence had documented, his financial stability through purchasing his gambling debts and mortgage at discount prices, then demanding immediate full repayment, his personal relationships through exposing his ongoing affairs to current girlfriend and to police supervisors who officially prohibited such conduct during duty hours, and ultimately his physical safety through action that would permanently eliminate his capacity to abuse black women or any other Harlem residents, while also serving as warning to other corrupt officers about costs of crossing boundaries that Johnson's organization enforced more effectively than legal institutions ever had or would. The execution phase began Thursday, June 20th at 6:47 a.m. when Internal Affairs Bureau received anonymous package containing photographs of O'Sullivan collecting protection payments from 5 different Harlem businesses, copies of his bank statements showing deposits inconsistent with his official NYPD salary, detailed written log documenting his gambling activities at 2 illegal establishments that paid protection to different corrupt officers, and witness statements from 3 Harlem residents willing to testify about O'Sullivan planting evidence during arrests that had resulted in convictions later overturned when appellate lawyers discovered prosecutorial misconduct but which had never resulted in investigations of O'Sullivan's role manufacturing the false cases. The package was addressed to Deputy Inspector William Donovan, one of few Internal Affairs supervisors with reputation for actually pursuing corruption cases rather than protecting fellow officers, and included cover letters stating that additional evidence would be provided if initial investigation appeared serious rather than perfunctory whitewash that usually resulted from internal NYPD investigations of officer misconduct. The financial pressure campaign intensified Friday, June 21st, when O'Sullivan received simultaneous notices that his mortgage holder demanded immediate payment of $8,900, claiming that he had violated terms through failure to maintain adequate property insurance that was actually current, but that bank claimed had lapsed due to paperwork errors that bank refused to correct until full payment was received, and that gambling operation where he owed $6,400 had sold his debt to unnamed collector demanding full payment within 72 hours or face consequences, including exposure to NYPD supervisors and potentially to criminal elements who would collect through methods exceeding simple financial extraction. The coordinated timing created overwhelming crisis that O'Sullivan lacked resources or strategies to manage given his limited legitimate income, substantial fixed expenses including alimony and basic living costs, and general financial mismanagement that had characterized his entire adult life and had contributed to his corruption as mechanism for supplementing inadequate salary with extortion proceeds that he spent as quickly as he collected them. The systematic destruction of O'Sullivan's life unfolded over 11 days following the June 19th incident with Mayme, during which time he experienced cascading failures across every dimension of his existence, including his NYPD career being suspended pending internal affairs investigation that discovered additional evidence corroborating the anonymous complaints, his financial obligations overwhelming his capacity to pay leading to foreclosure proceedings and threats of violent debt collection, his relationship with girlfriend ending when she learned about his multiple simultaneous affairs and his pattern of domestic violence toward previous partners, and his psychological deterioration manifesting in increased alcohol consumption, paranoid suspicions that someone was deliberately destroying his life, and reckless behavior suggesting that he recognized his situation was unsustainable but lacked either resources or intelligence to extract himself from spiral that was clearly intended to culminate in something far worse than mere loss of job and bankruptcy. Have you seen how systematic campaigns can dismantle targets' entire life through coordinated pressure at multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously? Hit like and subscribe, because the final phase of O'Sullivan's punishment would demonstrate that when corrupt police officers' institutional protection proved insufficient to prevent criminal retaliation, criminals possessed capabilities for inflicting consequences that should force reconsideration of why communities facing persistent police brutality sometimes relied on extra-legal violence to enforce accountability that legal institutions systematically failed to provide despite constitutional guarantees of equal protection under law. The kidnapping occurred Monday, July 1st at 11:34 p.m. when O'Sullivan left bar in Astoria, Queens, where he had been drinking alone since 8:15 p.m. His isolation reflecting how quickly his life had collapsed as friends and colleagues distanced themselves from officer whose corruption investigation threatened to implicate anyone associated with him in broader departmental scandal. The four men who grabbed O'Sullivan as he walked toward his car were professionals whose military training and organizational discipline ensured efficient capture with minimal risk of witnesses or evidence that might connect the operation to Johnson's organization, and within 47 seconds O'Sullivan was unconscious from chloroform-soaked cloth held over his face, secured with rope binding his hands and feet, and placed in trunk of car that departed the scene before any potential witnesses could observe the abduction or identify the vehicle. The interrogation began at approximately 12:43 a.m. Tuesday, July 2nd, in basement of warehouse in industrial section of Brooklyn, where Johnson's organization conducted operations requiring privacy from neighbors who might report suspicious activities to police. O'Sullivan regained consciousness to find himself strapped to chair with bright lights illuminating his face, while his interrogators remained in shadows that prevented him from identifying them clearly enough to provide useful descriptions if he survived the encounter and attempted to report his abduction to law enforcement officials, who O'Sullivan now desperately hoped might rescue him from predicament that his racist arrogance and corrupt behavior had created. The interrogation focused on extracting confession about O'Sullivan's specific acts of corruption and brutality that could be documented for potential future use, while also forcing him to confront the reality that his institutional protection meant nothing when he had violated boundaries enforced by organization possessing resources and determination, exceeding NYPD's willingness to protect corrupt officer who had become liability rather than asset to department. The decision about O'Sullivan's ultimate fate had already been made before the interrogation began, because Johnson's strategic calculation determined that allowing O'Sullivan to survive with mere warnings or temporary punishment would signal weakness that might encourage other corrupt officers to continue abusing Harlem residents, whereas O'Sullivan's permanent disappearance would send unmistakable message throughout 28th Precinct and broader NYPD that attacking Johnson's family or interests triggered consequences that badges and institutional solidarity couldn't prevent. However, the method chosen for O'Sullivan's elimination reflected Johnson's understanding that creating mystery about his fate would be more effective deterrent than obviously violent murder that might trigger intensive NYPD response, including potential retaliation against Johnson's organization through mechanisms including planted evidence, false charges, or coordinated raids designed to disrupt operations even if they couldn't produce convictions. The construction site in South Bronx, where a massive housing project was being built under federal urban renewal funding, provided perfect location for disposing of O'Sullivan's body in ways that would likely prevent discovery for decades if ever, because the project involved pouring thousands of cubic yards of concrete for foundations and structural elements, and because construction workers who Johnson's organization had cultivated as sources and occasional accomplices ensured access to site after hours when normal security was minimal and easily avoided through knowledge of patrol patterns and blind spots in coverage. The timing coordinated with concrete pour scheduled for Wednesday, July 3rd meant that O'Sullivan's body could be positioned in forms before concrete was poured. ensuring that once the pour was completed, his remains would be encased in solid concrete that would cure over following days into permanent tomb, unlikely to be disturbed before eventual building demolition many decades in future, if ever. The implementation occurred Tuesday night, July 2nd into early morning Wednesday, July 3rd, when O'Sullivan's bound and gagged but still living body was transported from Brooklyn warehouse to South Bronx construction site and positioned in foundation forms in section where concrete pour was scheduled to begin at 6 a.m. The deliberate decision to place O'Sullivan in forms while he remained alive rather than killing him first reflected Johnson's judgment that this method would maximize both punishment and deterrent effect by ensuring that O'Sullivan experienced conscious awareness of his fate for whatever time remained before either suffocation or concrete weight caused death, and that anyone who might eventually discover his remains would understand from positioning and binding that this had been deliberate execution rather than accidental death or spontaneous crime of passion. The rope binding was designed to restrain without allowing any possibility of escape, but also to remain visible in concrete encasing the body if remains were eventually discovered, creating physical evidence that would communicate to anyone examining the scene that this person had been deliberately sealed into foundation as punishment for offenses requiring this extreme response. The concrete pour began at 6:03 a.m. Wednesday, July 3rd, and continued for approximately 7 hours until section containing O'Sullivan's body was completely filled to depth of 18 inches, covering his position by approximately 14 inches of concrete that would cure into solid mass, making discovery essentially impossible without demolishing entire structure, which no one would have reason to do unless building was eventually torn down for redevelopment many decades later. The construction workers conducting the pour had no knowledge that human body was positioned in forms because Johnson's people had placed O'Sullivan during night hours when site was unoccupied and had ensured that his position was in section that would be poured early in sequence before any workers would have reason to examine forms closely enough to notice anything unusual. The foreman overseeing the pour was on Johnson's payroll, receiving monthly payments totaling $400 in exchange for providing occasional access to construction sites and for maintaining ignorance about whatever purposes Johnson's organization used such access for, and he asked no questions about whether anything unusual might have occurred at site overnight before his crew arrived to begin scheduled concrete work. Sergeant Michael O'Sullivan's disappearance was reported to NYPD on Thursday, July 4th, when he failed to appear for internal affairs interview scheduled that morning regarding corruption investigation that had been ongoing since anonymous evidence package arrived 2 weeks earlier. The missing persons investigation initially focused on theory that O'Sullivan might have fled to avoid corruption charges, but his failure to access bank accounts or contact family members gradually shifted investigative focus toward suspicion that he might have met foul play possibly connected to his corruption activities, creating enemies among both criminal elements whose businesses he had extorted and police colleagues who feared his cooperation with investigators might implicate them in broader departmental scandal. The investigation never developed meaningful leads about O'Sullivan's disappearance because Johnson's organization had conducted the kidnapping and disposal with professional competence that left no physical evidence connecting operation to them, and because NYPD investigators' focus on possible criminal or police suspects never seriously considered that O'Sullivan's abuse of black woman 2 weeks earlier might have triggered retaliation from her husband's organization that possessed both motive and capability to permanently eliminate corrupt officer who had violated boundaries that Harlem's criminal operators enforced more consistently than legal institutions ever had. The rumors that circulated through 28th Precinct and broader Harlem community about O'Sullivan's disappearance included accurate speculation that Johnson's organization had been involved in eliminating officer who had made fatal mistake of physically assaulting and threatening Bumpy's wife, though most versions of story circulating among police officers dismissed such theories as impossible, given that killing cop would trigger intensive investigation that criminals allegedly would want to avoid. The disconnect between police officers' assumptions about criminals' risk calculations and actual strategic thinking that informed Johnson's decision to eliminate O'Sullivan demonstrated how institutional arrogance and racism prevented white officers from recognizing that black criminal operators possessed sophisticated intelligence about when violent retaliation served strategic purposes, even if it risked attracting law enforcement attention. The fact that O'Sullivan's body was never discovered and investigation eventually went cold without any arrests validated Johnson's strategic calculation that method of disposal would successfully prevent his organization being connected to disappearance, and that deterrent effect on other corrupt officers would be achieved through rumors and speculation that everyone in 28th Precinct would hear and understand, even without official confirmation. The broader implications of O'Sullivan's elimination extended far beyond punishment of single corrupt officer to reshape behavior among 28th Precinct police who had previously operated with sense of complete impunity regarding their treatment of Harlem residents. The sudden disappearance of officer known for aggressive racism and brutality created atmosphere of uncertainty and fear among cops who recognized that institutional protection they had relied on might not extend to situations where they provoked criminal organizations powerful enough to retaliate effectively despite risks from law enforcement response. Several corrupt officers who had been particularly aggressive in their abuse of black citizens began moderating their behavior, not because they suddenly developed moral opposition to racism or corruption, but because they calculated that survival required avoiding confrontations with residents connected to Johnson's organization or other criminal groups capable of violent retaliation that NYPD apparently couldn't prevent or solve when it occurred. However, celebrating criminal elimination of corrupt police officer requires acknowledging profound moral complexities about whether extrajudicial violence against state officials, regardless of provocation or justification based on their misconduct, advances justice or simply substitutes one form of lawlessness for another while undermining institutional frameworks that should govern responses to official abuse through legal channels providing accountability without depending on criminal power. O'Sullivan's racism, corruption, and brutality deserved punishment including termination from NYPD, criminal prosecution for his various illegal activities, and civil liability for damages he inflicted on victims whose constitutional rights he violated. The fact that such legal accountability was extremely unlikely to occur given NYPD's patterns of protecting corrupt officers demonstrates institutional failures, creating situations where communities facing persistent police abuse had no effective legal recourse. But whether criminal violence provided legitimate alternative to failed legal processes remains contested question, requiring examination of both immediate justice achieved through O'Sullivan's elimination and long-term consequences of relying on criminal enforcement of standards that legal institutions should uphold. The institutional failures that created situation where corrupt police officers' abuse of black woman resulted in his murder by criminal organization included NYPD's systematic refusal to discipline officers for corruption and brutality that internal affairs investigations documented but rarely led to terminations or prosecutions, prosecutors' unwillingness to bring charges against police officers who committed crimes during their duties, courts' patterns of accepting police testimony over citizens' complaints regardless of evidence supporting victims' accounts, and political systems excluding black communities from meaningful influence over policing priorities and accountability mechanisms. These structural inequalities meant that legal channels for addressing police misconduct were largely unavailable to black citizens who experienced abuse, leaving them dependent on either passive acceptance of their oppression or on extra-legal responses including criminal violence that achieved immediate accountability while creating new problems, including cycles of retaliation and general erosion of respect for legal institutions that should govern democratic societies. The moral question about whether communities facing systemic oppression from state institutions are justified in using violence to enforce boundaries that law refuses to protect doesn't have simple answer, but rather requires sustained examination of how institutional failures create impossible choices between accepting injustice and depending on criminal power, whose violence may achieve specific justice goals while perpetuating broader harms and undermining already fragile institutional legitimacy. O'Sullivan's elimination satisfied immediate need for accountability and created deterrent effect, moderating other officers' abusive behavior. But it also reinforced patterns where criminal violence substituted for legal processes and where Johnson's organization accumulated power partly through providing protection that legal institutions failed to deliver. Understanding this complexity requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. O'Sullivan deserved punishment for his crimes. Legal institutions failed to provide justice. Criminal violence achieved accountability that law refused to enforce, and reliance on such violence created moral and practical problems that no amount of justification about institutional failures could fully resolve. If you've considered moral complexities of using illegal violence to address official misconduct when legal institutions systematically fail to provide accountability, hit subscribe for more stories exploring impossible choices communities face when systemic oppression meets institutional indifference. Tell us in comments whether you think Johnson's elimination of O'Sullivan was justified given circumstances, or whether celebrating such violence perpetuates cycles harmful regardless of immediate justice achieved. The investigation into O'Sullivan's disappearance officially remained open for 7 years until 1964. When NYPD closed case as unsolved missing person with presumption that he had met foul play, but without sufficient evidence to pursue any suspects or develop meaningful leads about his fate. The file noted his corruption investigation and suggested that enemies from either criminal elements or police colleagues might have been involved, but investigators never seriously pursued Johnson's organization as suspects because they lacked evidence connecting him to disappearance, and because prevailing assumptions about criminals' desire to avoid attracting police attention made elimination of NYPD officers seem unlikely strategy regardless of provocation. The failure to solve O'Sullivan's disappearance represented both investigative incompetence stemming from racist assumptions about black criminals' capabilities and strategic success by Johnson's organization in conducting operation with professional competence that prevented discovery or prosecution. The long-term impact on policing in Harlem included modest improvements in officer behavior, resulting more from deterrent effect of O'Sullivan's mysterious disappearance than from any institutional reforms addressing systemic racism and corruption that characterized NYPD's relationship with black communities throughout 1950s and 1960s. Some officers who had been particularly aggressive in abusing residents began exercising more caution about targeting people connected to powerful criminal organizations, though racist attitudes and corrupt practices continued among officers who either didn't believe rumors about O'Sullivan's fate or who calculated that benefits from continuing their extortion and brutality exceeded risks from potential criminal retaliation. The fundamental pattern of NYPD treating Harlem as occupied territory requiring suppression rather than community deserving protection persisted through subsequent decades, despite various reform efforts and commission investigations that documented problems but rarely produced meaningful accountability or structural changes. Bumpy Johnson's decision to eliminate O'Sullivan represented both personal revenge for attack on Mayme and strategic decision to enforce boundaries that protected his organization's interests and Harlem community members from most egregious police abuses, even while his criminal activities simultaneously harmed that same community through gambling operations and violence that extracted wealth and lives from residents already suffering from poverty and discrimination. This contradiction between Johnson as community protector and community predator reflected larger patterns where black criminal organizations provided some services that legal institutions refused to deliver while also perpetuating harm through their illegal activities, creating morally complicated legacies that resist simple categorization as either beneficial or destructive, but rather require nuanced understanding, acknowledging both positive and negative impacts on communities where they operated. Mayme Johnson's experience of being grabbed and threatened by a corrupt police officer traumatized her despite her outward composure during and after the incident, and Bumpy's violent response provided both satisfaction that justice had been achieved and discomfort about being reasoned that another person had been killed regardless of how thoroughly that person deserved punishment for his crimes. Her later memoir mentioned the incident only briefly in sanitized form that acknowledged O'Sullivan had made grave mistake in showing disrespect to her, but that declined to specify either exact nature of his misconduct or consequences he faced beyond vague statement that Bumpy ensured such behavior would not be repeated. The restraint in her public account reflected both legal caution about admitting knowledge of murder and personal ambivalence about celebrating violence, even when directed against person who had attacked her and who represented systemic oppression that she and every black person in Harlem experienced daily from racist police force, treating them as subjects rather than citizens deserving equal protection under law. The construction site in South Bronx where O'Sullivan's body remained entombed in concrete foundation eventually became large public housing project completed in 1959 and serving thousands of residents over subsequent decades without anyone suspecting that building's foundation contained remains of corrupt police officer who had been executed and disposed of in permanent concrete tomb. The building stood for 53 years until 2012 demolition as part of urban renewal project replacing aging public housing with mixed-income development, but demolition crews never discovered O'Sullivan's remains because his position in foundation was in section that wasn't examined during environmental assessment and archaeological survey that New York City regulations required before demolition could proceed. The permanent character of his concrete entombment meant that O'Sullivan's fate likely will never be officially confirmed unless some future construction or investigation accidentally discovers remains identifiable through dental records or DNA analysis if such methods could be applied to remains that have been sealed in concrete for decades. The story of corrupt police sergeant who grabbed Bumpy Johnson's wife and ended up buried in wet concrete represents intersection of multiple complex themes, including systemic police corruption and racism that characterized NYPD's treatment of Harlem during 1950s, institutional failures to hold abusive officers accountable through legal channels, criminal organizations' role as protectors providing accountability that law refused to enforce, and moral complexities of using illegal violence to address official misconduct when legal institutions systematically fail to provide justice. Understanding this history requires avoiding both romanticization of criminals as heroes fighting oppression and simplistic condemnation that ignores genuine protective functions they performed when institutions failed communities they were supposed to serve. The lesson for contemporary audiences is that functioning democratic societies must provide equal protection and accountability through legitimate legal institutions, rather than creating situations where communities depend on criminal violence to enforce boundaries against official abuse. The challenge remains building institutions that actually deliver justice rather than protecting corrupt officials whose misconduct undermines public trust and legitimacy of legal systems supposedly governing democratic society. O'Sullivan's story demonstrates both the tragedy of systemic failures requiring extra-legal responses and the danger of normalizing criminal violence as solution to institutional problems requiring structural reforms rather than individual revenge, however justified that revenge might be given circumstances. The moral complexity of understanding Bumpy Johnson's elimination of O'Sullivan reflects broader American struggles with how to address police brutality and corruption when legal institutions systematically refuse to hold officers accountable for misconduct. Johnson's action achieved immediate justice and created deterrent effect, moderating some officers' behavior, but it existed within context of criminal career causing substantial harm through exploitation of Harlem's residents and perpetuation of violence that damaged community in various ways. Understanding Johnson requires holding these contradictions rather than resolving them into convenient narratives, celebrating him as hero or condemning him as villain, because both characterizations miss the complex reality of how systemic oppression and institutional failures created situations where criminal power sometimes served protective functions while simultaneously perpetuating different forms of harm and exploitation. The systemic changes necessary to eliminate situations requiring criminal violence against corrupt police include meaningful accountability mechanisms, including independent oversight of police misconduct, criminal prosecutions of officers who commit crimes during their duties, civil liability systems that actually compensate victims and deter future abuse, and community control over policing priorities and resource allocation, ensuring that police serve communities rather than oppressing them. These reforms require sustained political organizing, litigation, legislation, and cultural transformation addressing racism that motivates police brutality and corruption that enables it. Progress has been uneven and incomplete despite decades of activism, demonstrating that achieving democratic policing requires constant vigilance and continued struggle, rather than one-time victories that permanently solve problems requiring ongoing attention and accountability.